The junkyard smelled like rust and rain, and Marcus Hale stood in the middle of it with $500 in his hand and nowhere else left to go. He was 38 years old. His work boots had a hole in the left sole. His jacket had a tear along the shoulder that he'd patched twice with electrical tape, and the tape had started peeling again somewhere around November. People who looked at Marcus Hale on that particular Tuesday morning saw a man who had already lost a man whose posture carried the weight of a mortgage he couldn't pay, a car that had finally quit on him at the worst possible moment, and a daughter at home who needed breakfast and didn't know the electricity bill was 3 months overdue. What those people didn't see was what Marcus saw every single morning when he looked in the cracked bathroom mirror: a father. That was the only identity that still held. His wife, Claire, had been gone 4 years. Cancer, the slow kind. The kind that gives you enough time to say goodbye but not enough time to figure out how to actually survive after. She'd passed on a Wednesday in February, and Marcus remembered the specific quality of the light that day: gray and thin, like the sky itself was tired. Lily had been 4 years old. She'd stood at the foot of the hospital bed in pink sneakers and hadn't cried, not because she didn't understand, but because children that age understand everything and nothing at once. Marcus had held it together in that room and fallen apart in the parking garage stairwell where no one could hear him. He'd been holding it together in various stairwells ever since. He worked 3 jobs at the peak of it: delivery driver at night, stock clerk at a grocery warehouse 2 mornings a week, and occasional handyman work whenever a neighbor posted something on the community board. He was good with engines. He always had been. His father had taught him before the old man's hands went bad with arthritis, and Marcus had kept that knowledge the way you keep something irreplaceable: carefully, quietly, always within reach. But the delivery job was gone now. His car, a 2008 sedan with 190,000 miles on it, had given up the ghost on Route 9 at 11:40 on a Monday night. And his dispatcher had told him, not unkindly, that they needed drivers with reliable vehicles. That was the language of the working world: reliable. As though reliability was a thing you chose rather than a thing you either had the money to maintain or didn't. Marcus had been given his final paycheck by direct deposit and a voicemail that wished him luck. He'd listened to the voicemail twice and then deleted it. His friend Darnell had told him to use the $500 on groceries and overdue bills. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had said the same thing, more gently, over a cup of coffee she'd brought uninvited to his door because she could read the particular slant of his shoulders. They were both right. It was the sensible thing. It was the safe thing. Marcus knew it. He bought the car anyway. It sat in the far corner of Ridley's Auto Salvage, like something that had given up trying to look like a car. The body was a faded burgundy, sun-bleached to something closer to the color of dried brick. The passenger side mirror was gone. 3 of the 4 hubcaps were missing. The interior had been partially stripped. The rear seat was there, but the dashboard panels had been removed along one side, exposing wiring that someone had neatly bundled with zip ties, which struck Marcus as strange. You didn't strip a car neatly unless you knew what you were doing, and you were being careful about it. Earl Ridley, who ran the yard and had been running it since the Reagan administration, shrugged when Marcus asked about the history, said it came in off a tow from the interstate about 6 weeks back. Driver wasn't with the vehicle. He'd waved a hand vaguely when Marcus pressed for more. The car had been sitting long enough that Earl was losing yard space, which was the only reason the price was $500 instead of $1,200. Engine turns over, Earl had said. That's more than I can promise about half the cars in here. And then, scratching his chin, tell you what, if that thing runs longer than 3 days without dying on you, I'll give your $500 back. He said it the way men say things they know they'll never have to make good on. Marcus had shaken his hand anyway. The drive home was slow and cautious. Marcus keeping the car at 40 miles per hour and listening to every sound the engine made the way. You listened to a new conversation carefully, cataloging. What he heard surprised him. Under all the cosmetic ruin, the engine ran smooth. Smoother than it had any right to. When he popped the hood in his building's parking lot and looked at the engine block with a flashlight, he found what he'd suspected: the engine had been worked on recently, and worked on well. modified even. Certain components replaced with better parts than the car's model year would have originally carried. Someone with real knowledge had gotten under this hood and done serious work. That same careful, intentional quality that showed in the bundled wiring showed in the engine. This car had been prepared for something. Marcus didn't know what. He stood in the parking lot for a long time in the cold, trying to puzzle it out, and then he went upstairs to make Lily dinner. It was Lily who found the compartment. She was 8 years old and had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of touching things to understand them, running her fingers along surfaces, knocking on walls to hear what was hollow. She was sitting in the back seat the next afternoon, narrating an imaginary road trip for her stuffed rabbit, when she pressed her palm flat against the floor panel under the rear seat and heard the difference in the sound. She told her father, in that matter-of-fact way children report miraculous things. "Dad, this part is fake." Marcus had reached under and found the release a small magnetic latch, invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. The compartment beneath was shallow, barely 2 inches deep, but it was there, and inside it were two things. A clear plastic sleeve containing a folded document printed in a font too small to read without good light, and a USB drive with a cracked casing, as though it had been stepped on or dropped from a height, and survived, just barely. Beside the USB, scratched directly into the metal floor of the compartment, in something sharp, a key, maybe, or a nail, were 9 words. "If I die, do not trust Evelyn Carter." Marcus sat in the car for a long time looking at those words. Then he looked up Carter Tech on his phone. He recognized the name. Anyone who read the news recognized the name. Carter Tech was one of the largest private technology firms in the country. Artificial intelligence infrastructure, data management systems, government contracts. Evelyn Carter, its founder and chief executive, was 44 years old and had appeared on the covers of more business publications than Marcus could count in the 10 seconds he spent scrolling. She was described in every profile as controlled, brilliant, and formidable. The press called her the Iron Woman of Wall Street, though her company was technically headquartered in the city rather than on the street itself. She had a daughter, according to one profile, a 10-year-old named Sophie. There was one photograph of Sophie, clearly taken without full consent, showing a small girl in a school uniform looking sideways at the camera, with an expression that was already practiced in the art of not giving anything away. Daughter of the Iron Woman. Marcus felt something he couldn't name when he looked at that photograph, something between pity and recognition. Across the city, in a glass and steel tower that occupied an entire block of the financial district, Evelyn Carter was on her 4th call of the evening, having been on calls since 6 in the morning with breaks only for coffee and a 12-minute lunch eaten at her desk without tasting it. The merger was the size of a small country's annual budget, and the board wanted it completed before the fiscal quarter closed, and there were 17 distinct points of legal contention that each needed resolution before the documents could be signed, and Evelyn Carter was the only person in any of the rooms who could hold all 17 in her head simultaneously while conducting a negotiation. She was that kind of mind, the kind that processes parallel threads without losing the through line, that finds the pattern in noise others experience only as noise. It was the quality that had made her company, and it was the quality that had cost her, over the years, a marriage, 3 close friendships, and the particular irretrievable kind of time that you do not realize you are spending until it is already spent. Her assistant knocked at 7:40 and said her daughter's school had called. Again, Sophie had been removed from the afternoon equestrian session after telling her instructor, with complete composure, that the program was pedagogically unsound. The instructor had been offended. The school's coordinator had been diplomatic. Evelyn had told her assistant to send flowers to the instructor and to schedule a call with the coordinator for tomorrow morning, and then had felt, as she returned to her documents, the specific quality of guilt that comes from handling your child the same way you handle a vendor dispute. Sophie was 10. Sophie had her father's mouth and Evelyn's eyes, and a habit of going very still in large social situations that Evelyn recognized as her own, inherited and now belonging to the next generation. She loved her daughter with a ferocity that sat entirely below the surface, that she had never been entirely sure she had communicated. The security detail she'd assigned to Sophie 3 months ago, 2 former federal agents, rotating shifts, a protocol so airtight it had earned the nickname the perimeter among the men who ran it, was, in some ways, the most legible language of love she knew. She had been told, by a therapist she'd seen twice, and then stopped seeing because the sessions conflicted with a board meeting, that this was avoidant attachment expressed through infrastructure. She had not disagreed. What Evelyn did not know, in that glass tower, reviewing merger documents with her 4th coffee going cold beside her keyboard, was that the meeting she would have with the deliveryman from the South Side in approximately 72 hours would be the most consequential meeting of her adult life. She did not know that someone in her organization had been watching a salvage yard on the East Side with the specific anxiety of a man who has lost something critical and has not yet confirmed whether it is truly gone. And she did not know that a man she had never met had spent his last $500 on the vehicle that carried the proof of everything Walsh had worked so carefully to bury. She was good at anticipating threats. She was very good, but she had anticipated them from directions she understood: competitors, regulators, market forces, the press. She had not anticipated the direction from which this particular truth was going to arrive. The drive was cracked, but not dead. It opened as read-only, and most of the files were corrupted or encrypted blocks of characters that resolved into nothing legible. But one folder had survived. Inside it was a single video file, 7 minutes and 40 seconds long, partially corrupted at the end, so that the final minute cut to static. The man on the screen was seated at a desk in what looked like a home office. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that would have been easy to trust: open, tired, careful. He identified himself at the start of the recording: Daniel Ross, Senior Systems Engineer, Carter Tech. He spoke quietly, with the precision of a man who has rehearsed what he's saying because he knows he may not get another chance to say it. What he described, in the 7 minutes before the static swallowed his voice, was a surveillance system. Not the ordinary kind. A passive data collection architecture embedded in Carter Tech's flagship municipal infrastructure software that was currently operating in 14 American cities, processing traffic systems, utility grids, emergency dispatch. The embedded layer, Daniel said, collected behavioral data on individuals at scale, without disclosure, without consent, and without any legal authorization whatsoever. And the board of directors, not Evelyn Carter, but the board that surrounded her, had entered into a preliminary agreement to sell access to that data stream to a foreign intelligence entity whose name was redacted in the video, but whose logo, visible for 2 frames on a document Daniel held up to the camera, Marcus did not recognize. Daniel said he had brought his concerns to 2 board members and been dismissed. He said he had then compiled evidence and taken it to an attorney. He said he was recording this video because he was afraid. The video cut out before he said what he was afraid of specifically, but the sentence he'd scratched into the floor of the car answered that question well enough. Marcus sat in the kitchen for a long time after the video ended. He was not a man given to panic. Panic required a surplus of energy that single fathers doing 3 jobs didn't generally have, but his hands were not entirely steady when he closed the laptop. He thought about calling the police, and then he thought about what a man with $500 and an eviction notice on his second warning was likely to be told when he walked into a police station claiming to have evidence against a billion-dollar technology company. He thought about the scratched words in the car's floor. He thought about Daniel Ross, whose name he now searched and found in a single news brief from 14 months ago: a traffic accident on a rural highway, ruled accidental, no other vehicles involved. He looked at the photograph that accompanied the brief. The face matched the man in the video. He didn't sleep much. In the morning, he dropped Lily at school, came home, and sat at the kitchen table, trying to think through what to do. An hour later, he got up to go to the bathroom, and when he came back, the front door was open. He had locked it. He was certain he had locked it. He ran through the apartment in 4 seconds, checked every room, looked under every piece of furniture large enough to conceal a child, and found nothing. Lily's room was empty. Her backpack was at school. Her rabbit was on the bed. Marcus stood in the center of his daughter's room and felt the entire world drop away beneath his feet. The call came 40 minutes later, from a number he didn't recognize. A man's voice, flat and businesslike. Bring the car to an address on the east side of the industrial district. Come alone, come now. Marcus drove. He had no other choice. He had exactly one speed on that drive, which was controlled and forward, because the alternative, the shaking, the spiral, the terror, was not something he could afford until Lily was safe. When he reached the address, a loading dock behind a closed printing facility, he found two men he'd never seen before, and his daughter, sitting on a metal crate, eating a granola bar. Lily looked at her father with the expression of someone who has decided not to be frightened until she sees whether her father is frightened first. Marcus had kept his face still for her sake. For his sake, for whatever both of them had left. The men were not, it turned out, the kind of people who hurt children. They were the kind of people who operated in the margins of larger problems, hired not for violence but for information retrieval. They'd taken Lily not to harm her, but to ensure Marcus's cooperation. And once they'd confirmed that he genuinely had no idea what was in the car when he bought it, that he was exactly what he appeared to be, a desperate man who'd made an impractical purchase, they released her without ceremony. One of the men, the shorter one, looked at Marcus before leaving and said, without particular emotion, "If the people at the top of Carter Tech find out you have that car, both of you are dead." Then they got in their vehicle and left. Marcus stood with Lily pressed against his chest for a long time, her small hands gripping his jacket. And neither of them said anything for a while. He drove home slowly. He put Lily to bed early, telling her it was an adventure, and that adventures sometimes included granola bars in unusual places. She didn't entirely believe him. She was 8, not 4, but she went along with it because she trusted him, and because children understand more than adults give them credit for and choose, sometimes, to let the adult have the story they need. That night, Marcus turned on the local news while he was washing dishes, not really watching, and then the anchor said a name that made him stop. Sophie Carter. 10 years old. Missing. Last seen leaving a private academy in the Upper District. Carter Tech's security detail, which had been accompanying the girl, had reported losing contact with her vehicle in the area near the highway interchange during the storm. Police were asking for information. The photograph they showed was the same one Marcus had seen, that sideways glance, that practiced guardedness. He stood with his hands still in the soapy water and looked at the television screen for a long time. The storm had come in off the coast that evening, faster than predicted. The kind of storm that makes meteorologists issue corrections and apologies simultaneously. Marcus had gone back out at 10 o'clock, not because he still had his delivery job, he didn't, but because Mrs. Patterson upstairs had needed medication from the 24-hour pharmacy and was afraid to drive in the weather, and Marcus was not the kind of man who said no to that. He was on the elevated interstate, the rain coming sideways across the windshield, when he saw the SUV. It was moving wrong, not damaged, not stalled, but not moving under its own driver's will either. There was a second vehicle alongside it, a dark sedan running without lights, and the SUV was being herded toward the right shoulder. Marcus understood what he was seeing. In the same moment, he recognized the corporate insignia on the SUV's rear panel, Carter Tech's fleet. He'd seen the logo in the car's compartment. On the tow receipt Earl had shoved in the glove box without thinking. He'd been looking at that logo for 3 days. He had a fraction of a second to decide. He had always heard that these moments were slow, that adrenaline elongated time into something navigable. It was not slow. It was a single compressed instant in which he saw everything at once: the rain on the windshield, the dark sedan's angle, the SUV's rear tires losing traction on the wet surface, the guardrail toward which the vehicle was being pushed. And then he saw Lily's face, which was not there but was always there, and he thought of the man in the video saying quietly that he was afraid. And he thought of 9 words scratched into metal by someone who had chosen to trust the truth to whatever came next. He thought of a 10-year-old girl in a school uniform with a practiced, guarded expression, and no idea that the world her mother had built for her was full of cracks. He thought of Daniel Ross on a rural highway, alone. Marcus pressed the accelerator. What happened next was something he would spend a long time afterward trying to explain, and never entirely succeeding. The sedan, the broken down, stripped out, $500 piece of salvaged metal accelerated like nothing he'd ever driven. Not like an old car running on borrowed time. Like something engineered. The modifications under the hood, the ones he'd noticed but not fully understood, delivered power that had no business coming from that chassis. He used the car as a wedge, positioning it between the herding vehicle and the SUV, forcing a gap, absorbing the impact of the dark sedan's attempt to correct its course. The crash was not catastrophic. Controlled is a better word, if barely. The herding vehicle lost control on the wet pavement and struck the barrier wall. The SUV came to rest on the shoulder with 2 flat tires and a crumpled panel. Marcus sat in his car for 3 seconds, listening to his own breathing. Then he got out into the rain. Sophie Carter was in the back seat of the SUV. The driver was unconscious, but breathing head wound from the airbag. Serious, but not immediately fatal. Sophie was shaken but unhurt, pressed into the corner of the seat with her knees drawn up and her eyes open very wide. She looked at Marcus the way her mother's photograph had suggested she might look at most things, with wariness and assessment running simultaneously. He told her his name. He said she was safe. He said he was going to call for help, and she should stay in the vehicle, she said. In a voice steadier than most adults could have managed in the same situation. You should know that the people who did this work for my mother's company. Then she looked past Marcus at the car idling on the shoulder with its headlights cutting through the rain, and something changed in her expression. I've seen that car before, she said quietly. It was in the parking structure at Carter Tech. About a year ago, it was Dr. Ross's car. The police came. Paramedics came. 2 unmarked cars came very quickly after, carrying men in suits who spoke quietly into earpieces and took Sophie away before Marcus could say another word to her. An officer took his statement. Marcus gave the basic facts and omitted the compartment and the USB and the 9 scratched words, because the men in suits had looked at him with the kind of eyes that do a calculation, and he did not yet know whose side the calculation came out on. He drove home in the rain with a cracked headlight and a dented right quarter panel, and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside. Evelyn Carter came to him. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected, if anything, to receive a formal communication from a legal team, or perhaps nothing at all. The powerful have many ways of managing the inconvenient. But she came herself, the following morning, with a driver who waited outside and no visible security. She was taller than her photographs suggested. She wore a gray coat that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, and she held herself with the particular stillness of someone who is accustomed to filling a room by occupying the center of it. She looked at the $500 sedan parked in the spot beside Marcus's building, and her composure, which was considerable, did something almost imperceptible at the edges. That's Daniel's car, she said. Not a question. The conversation in Marcus's kitchen was not comfortable. Evelyn Carter was not a comfortable person. She asked questions with the directness of someone who has learned that directness is faster and less painful in the long run than any other approach, and Marcus answered them with the same quality of directness, because he was tired and because he was not, despite everything, afraid of her. He was angry, which is different. He told her about the compartment, the document, the USB, the video. He did not tell her everything immediately. He watched her face while he told her, watching for calculation, for performance, for the specific flatness that falls over a guilty face, receiving information it already possesses. What he saw instead was something that looked genuinely like a person being struck by something they had not prepared for. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, went very still. That was all, but it was enough. He continued. Evelyn Carter had not known. That was the truth of it. And Marcus came to believe it. And not only because she said so, the surveillance architecture Daniel Ross had documented had been developed and implemented under the authority of the board's technology committee, a subcommittee chaired by the company's vice president, a man named Griffin Walsh, who had managed the project with a degree of structural insulation that had kept it entirely outside Evelyn's operational purview. Evelyn had been the public face, the vision, the intellectual center of Carter Tech. Walsh had been the infrastructure, and Walsh had understood, for the 3 years the program had been operational, that the program's existence was the one thing that could destroy not just his position but the company itself, and possibly land him in federal custody. When Daniel Ross had gone to 2 board members with his concerns, those board members had gone to Walsh. Walsh had handled it. The road accident on the rural highway had been handled. The car, which Daniel had used to transport physical copies of the documentation because he didn't trust digital transfer, had been sent to impound under a false name and eventually auctioned to a salvage yard because Walsh had assumed the documentation was either destroyed in the accident or already recovered. It hadn't been. It had been sitting under the back seat of a stripped-down sedan in Earl Ridley's lot, waiting for a man with $500 and no other options to walk in off the street. Evelyn wanted to buy the car. She offered $1 million, which she stated without theater. The way you state the price of a thing you intend to purchase. Marcus said no. He looked at her across the kitchen table, with its mismatched chairs and its surface worn soft from years of homework and breakfast, and the accumulated domestic texture of a life lived on no margin at all, and he said no. Not because the money wasn't real to him. $1 million would have ended every specific fear he'd been carrying for 4 years, but he understood that if he sold her the car and the evidence in it, the shape of what happened next was entirely in her hands. And whatever Evelyn Carter was brilliant, cold, capable, and quite possibly innocent of what her company had done, she was still the most powerful person in any room she entered. Marcus had spent his life in rooms where the most powerful person's interests determined the outcome. He wasn't going to take that bet. He told her this plainly, without apology, and watched her process it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, almost to herself, Daniel was right to record that video. That night, someone ran Marcus's car off the road. He was driving home from a gas station, 2 miles from his building, when a black SUV with no plates came out of a side street and hit the sedan on the driver's side with enough force to send it onto the shoulder and into the guardrail. The sedan's reinforced frame, one of Daniel's modifications, Marcus later understood kept the cabin intact. He was concussed, his right arm cut from the shattered window, his ribs badly bruised on the left side where the door compressed. He climbed out of the wreck onto the dark shoulder of the road and sat on the guardrail in the cold for a moment. The SUV was gone. He called Evelyn because she was the only person in his phone who had the kind of resources to respond to what had just happened. And because Lily was at Sophie's, the 2 girls having been placed together at Evelyn's house while the situation was being assessed, and he needed to know they were safe. They were. Sophie had apparently decided that Lily was her responsibility and had been looking after her with the focused intensity of a child who does not often get to be responsible for something smaller than herself. Lily had apparently decided that Sophie was lonely in a way she recognized, and had given her the stuffed rabbit to hold. Marcus refused the hospital. He let Evelyn's driver take him to her house, where a company physician examined him, taped his ribs, cleaned the arm wound, and told him things he already knew about concussions in the language of professional understatement. He sat in Evelyn's living room, which was large and beautiful, and somehow less comfortable than his own kitchen, and looked at his daughter asleep on a sofa, with the rabbit tucked under her chin, and Sophie sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her, reading a book, having apparently appointed herself night watch. Evelyn came and stood beside him, and they both looked at the 2 girls without speaking for a moment. Evelyn said quietly, so as not to wake them, I gave everything to build this company. I thought that was what strength looked like. Marcus said nothing. He was not a man who gave speeches, but after a moment he said, Lily used to cry at night after Claire died. Every night, for a year, I would go in and sit on the floor beside her bed and just stay there until she went back to sleep. I didn't say anything most nights. She just needed to know I was there. Evelyn looked at Sophie for a long moment. Something shifted in her face that had nothing to do with calculation. I've missed so much, she said. I know, Marcus said. He wasn't being unkind. He was being honest. He was also being kind, in the way that honesty sometimes is. Walsh moved first. He had been monitoring the situation through sources within the company's security apparatus, and he understood that the combination of Evelyn's awareness and Marcus's possession of the Daniel Ross evidence was now an existential threat that had advanced past the point where it could be managed quietly. He had Lily and Sophie taken from the house during a window, when the security detail was being rotated a gap of 11 minutes, which was enough. He delivered his terms through a proxy, the USB and all copies in exchange for the children, after which he intended to destroy the evidence, liquidate his offshore accounts, and disappear to a jurisdiction that did not extradite. He had a private flight leaving in 4 hours. Marcus drove. Evelyn was in the passenger seat, which was not a thing she had planned on, but Marcus had simply gotten in the driver's seat, and Evelyn had gotten in the other side, because the alternative was standing in her driveway while he went without her, and she was not made for standing still. The sedan moved through the city at speed, its modified engine quiet and certain under Marcus's hands. He had taped his ribs tighter. His arm was bandaged to the elbow. He drove with the focus of a man who had been stripped down to his most essential components, the ones that mattered, the ones that ran clean even when everything else was gone. The data center was in an industrial district on the south side, a facility that officially processed logistics software and unofficially housed the surveillance architecture's primary servers. There was a gate. Marcus drove through it. The gate lost. The car barely noticed. What followed inside the facility was not cinematic in the way Marcus had seen in movies. It was faster and uglier and more frightening than that. There were 2 hired guards at the server room entrance. And Marcus had his size, and his years of physical work, and the specific advantage of a man with nothing left to lose, and Evelyn had her voice, and her authority, and the particular quality of fury that comes from a controlled person finally releasing the latch. Walsh was in the server room, working at a terminal, when they got the door open. He looked at Evelyn with the expression of a man who has run a careful calculation and is only now discovering an error in the formula. Evelyn had brought her own terminal, a tablet, pulled from her coat pocket, and she was already working. Daniel Ross, in his 14 months of preparation before his death, had built in a failsafe, a distributed upload protocol keyed to a specific sequence that could be triggered remotely, which he had shared with his attorney, who had contacted Evelyn 3 days ago when the story began breaking through the static. Walsh had not known about the attorney. That was the error in the formula. Evelyn triggered the protocol. The server room's network pushed its entire archive, all of it. Every transaction log, every data sharing agreement, every communication outward, simultaneously, to a list of recipients that included 3 federal agencies, 2 investigative journalism organizations, and a law firm specializing in whistleblower cases. Walsh moved toward the terminal to stop it. Marcus was between him and the terminal. Walsh made the calculation and sat down. Lily and Sophie had not been passive. They were in a storage room, 2 corridors away, locked in by a man who had underestimated them on the basis of their age. Lily had found a fire suppression panel on the wall. She had her mother's hands, her father's attention to surfaces, and 8 years of being told that the answer to a problem is almost always already in the room with you. She tripped the suppression system in that corridor only, which triggered the facility's emergency unlock protocol on all interior doors, which was a safety feature Walsh had not thought to disable, because he'd had 4 hours, and 4 hours is not enough time to think of everything. The girls walked out into the corridor and found Marcus coming from the opposite direction, and Lily ran to him with the specific kind of full-body relief that a child reserves for the confirmation of a fear that is now, finally, resolved. He caught her with his good arm and held her with the grip of a man who has been afraid in the specific way. You are afraid when the thing most precious to you is out of your hands, and who is now, slowly, putting that fear down. The server room caught fire 15 minutes later, an electrical failure in the overloaded network hardware. The kind of thing that happens when you push an infrastructure past its designed capacity in a matter of minutes. The sprinkler system was already compromised from Lily's maneuver. Marcus had gotten everyone out. Evelyn had her evidence transmitted. Walsh was sitting on the ground outside the facility being spoken to by two federal agents who had arrived with impressive speed, which suggested they had been monitoring the situation for some time and had been waiting for exactly this kind of decisive, documentable moment. Marcus stood in the parking lot with Lily on his hip and watched the data center burn and thought about Daniel Ross, who had recorded a video in a home office with the quiet voice of a careful, frightened man and had put the evidence in the safest place he had available, the floor of a car. He thought about the 9 scratched words. He thought about $500 and a junkyard and a hole in his left boot sole. The sedan sat in the parking lot with a cracked headlight and a dented quarter panel and a gate-shaped impression across its front bumper, running clean. What followed was the kind of public unwinding that takes months and fills the background of ordinary life, like weather, always present, always moving, always somewhere between stages. Griffin Walsh was indicted on federal charges within 6 weeks, the charges detailed and specific in a way that left no interpretive room. 3 board members, who had known, or should have known, followed. The foreign intelligence entity, whose name was eventually published in full by the investigative outlet that received the transmitted archive, became the subject of diplomatic communications at a level that had nothing to do with Marcus Hale or the South Side or a salvage yard, but that had everything to do with Daniel Ross's quiet, frightened, methodical preparation 14 months before his death. The attorney Daniel had contacted released a statement that was quoted in publications. Marcus had never expected to read and would not have found at the gas station where he used to buy his coffee before he had money for a better kind. The statement called Daniel Ross a man of extraordinary courage. Marcus agreed with that. He thought about it, sometimes, while he was working the specific courage it takes to record a video in a home office with no guarantee that anyone will ever watch it, and to trust that the truth has a kind of gravity that will eventually find its own level. No matter how long it takes, no matter what gets in the way. Carter Tech entered a period of supervised restructuring under a consent agreement with federal regulators. Evelyn Carter resigned the chief executive position voluntarily, which surprised the financial press and no one who had been paying attention to what the experience had done to her face, the particular softening of a person who has had their understanding of their own life corrected in a way that is painful and, ultimately, clarifying. She stayed involved in the company as a board member but began, for the first time in a decade, to be home before Sophie's bedtime most evenings. She was not, by nature, a warm person in the way that some people are warm. She didn't have the easy softness, the comfortable affect, but she was present, which was what Sophie had needed all along and had been too careful and too proud to say. Marcus received a settlement from the Carter Tech Restructuring Fund, a figure large enough to change the shape of his life, arrived in a bank account that had previously held amounts ending in single digits. He stood at the ATM the day the funds cleared and looked at the balance on the screen for a long time. A woman behind him in line said, gently, that she needed to use the machine. He apologized and stepped aside. He sat in his car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to locate the feeling he'd expected to have, the relief, the release, the sense of the floor finally rising to meet him. It was there. It was real. But underneath it was something else, something quieter, which was the knowledge that the number on the screen had come from Daniel Ross's courage and from Earl Ridley's offhand willingness to sell an unloved car, and from Lily's hands against a floor panel, and from a GPS that still worked, and from a highway in a storm where he'd made the only decision he could live with. The money was real, but it was downstream of something that couldn't be quantified, and Marcus knew the difference. He used enough of it to clear his debt and make Lily's future stable, a college fund in an account that would grow quietly over the next 10 years. A fund that he told Lily about on a Sunday evening, and that she received with a nod of such serious gravity that he had to look away to keep from laughing, because she was 8 years old and solemn about money in a way that was entirely her mother. With the rest, he opened a garage. It was small, 2 bays, a good lift, a parts room that smelled like metal and rubber and motor oil and felt, to him, like the most honest room he'd ever been inside. He put a small photograph of Claire on the wall above the tool bench, not framed, just fixed at the corners with pieces of tape. She was laughing in the photograph, caught mid-laugh, the way the best photographs catch people not posed, not ready, just real. He looked at it every morning when he unlocked the shop. He hired one mechanic to start, a young man named Travis who was better with transmissions than Marcus was, and who had a tendency to listen to loud music while he worked, which Marcus tolerated because the work was excellent and because the shop needed someone who arrived with energy instead of just competence. The garage did ordinary things: oil changes, brake work, exhaust systems, the unglamorous, reliable maintenance that keeps the world moving without anyone noticing it. Marcus was good at it. He was more than good at it. He had an understanding of engines that went beyond training, something almost intuitive. The kind of knowledge that exists in the hands as much as the mind, that his father had passed to him in a language that had nothing to do with words. The sedan he kept. It sat in the first bay, with a printed sign above it that Lily had made in red marker on a piece of cardboard, carefully lettered, "This car is not for sale." The cracked headlight had been replaced. The dented quarter panel had been straightened. The gate impression on the front bumper had been left as it was, because Marcus felt it was honest, and because he liked to look at it. He had not repaired the interior panels that Daniel Ross had removed. They remained open, the neat bundled wiring visible. A record of what someone careful and desperate had done to build something purposeful out of available materials. The compartment under the rear seat was still there. Empty now, but there. Sophie and Lily became the kind of friends that form when two children recognize something true about each other before anyone has taught them the language for it. They were different in almost every surface way: Sophie's tutored composure, Lily's unguarded expressiveness, Sophie's curated quiet, Lily's cheerful noise, but underneath that they were both children who had learned early that the people who loved them could leave or disappear, and who carried that knowledge carefully, like something fragile they didn't fully know how to protect. They made a good pair. They had sleepovers on alternating weekends. They fought occasionally, and made up quickly, and understood each other in the specific way of children who have already been serious. Lily brought the rabbit to every sleepover. Sophie had bought her own stuffed animal, a bear that she kept on her nightstand, with the practiced nonchalance of someone who does not want to seem sentimental and is entirely sentimental. Evelyn stopped by the garage one afternoon in early spring, unannounced, wearing clothes that were still expensive but somehow less armored-looking than before. She stood in the doorway of the first bay with a coffee from the place down the block and watched Marcus work on a customer's truck for a few minutes without either of them saying anything. Then she said, "I owe you something that I'm not sure I have the right words for." Marcus looked up from the truck. He had grease on his forearm and the particular calm expression of a person in the middle of work they understand. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I needed a car." She looked at the sedan behind him, at the cardboard sign above it. She almost smiled, not quite, but close, which for Evelyn Carter was the equivalent of someone else laughing out loud. She set the coffee on the workbench and left without fanfare, which was how Marcus preferred things to go. Lily asked him, on a Saturday morning in June, while they were eating cereal at the kitchen table that had been refinished now but was still the same table, with the same worn soft surface and the same mismatched chairs. He'd bought 2 matching ones at an estate sale, but hadn't been able to bring himself to get rid of the originals, so now there were 6 chairs for a 2-person table, which Lily had decided was ideal for guests. "Dad, do you regret buying that car?" She asked it with the careful face of someone who has been thinking about the question for a while and is finally ready to ask it. And with the specific quality of attention she brought to things she considered important, which was her mother's quality, and also, somehow, already entirely her own. Marcus put down his spoon. He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, and full of her mother's eyes, and her own particular, irreplaceable self, sitting in the morning light in a blue sweater, holding her cereal spoon like a small scepter. He thought about $500 and a hole in a boot sole and a salvage yard that smelled like rust and rain. He thought about a man who had recorded a video in a home office with the quiet voice of someone who understood that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it, and who had put the evidence in the safest place available to him. He thought about a compartment in a floor. He thought about 9 words scratched into metal. He thought about an engine that ran clean when it had no business running at all. He thought about a highway in a storm and a gate that gave way. He thought about Lily's hands in his jacket on a loading dock, gripping like they intended to hold on. He thought about two girls on a sofa, one asleep, one keeping watch, and a stuffed rabbit tucked under a chin. He thought about Daniel Ross, who had trusted a broken car with the only thing that mattered, and had not been wrong. He thought about Claire, laughing in a photograph above a tool bench in a shop that smelled like honesty and motor oil. Marcus looked at his daughter, and he smiled, the real kind. The kind that starts somewhere deep and works its way out slowly. The kind you cannot manufacture because it comes from knowing something true. Best decision I ever made, he said. Lily nodded, satisfied, as though the answer had confirmed something she already believed and had only needed to hear aloud. She went back to her cereal. Outside, the morning was ordinary and bright, and the garage 2 blocks away was opening for the day, and the sedan sat in its bay. Under the hand-lettered cardboard sign, "This car is not for sale, patient," and road-worn and dented, and still, in every way that mattered, running.